I'm going to read you a story. It's from one of my books. The book is called Thanks, I Needed That, and Other Stories of the Spirit. This is my second book. My first book, also a collection of about 40 stories, is called Life Doesn't Get Any Better Than This, The Holiness of Little Daily Dramas. All told, there are about 75 stories. They're all true stories, poignant, a little bit of humor, but mostly serious stories, kind of like, as you'll hear, like Garrison Keillor tells, or the Moth Story Hour, that style. The Wedding Photographer. When a history of humankind is written, let's say 100 or 200 years from now, wedding photograph albums will be just a blip. Think of it. For centuries, family lineages were maintained through carefully penned entries in heirloom Bibles to be passed from generation to generation. With the advent of still photography, formal portraits of brides and grooms became the rage, followed during the past few generations by black and white snapshots, then full-color wedding albums. Those big glossy pictures are still being produced, but along with them and ultimately replacing them are digital albums. No doubt within a short time there'll be something even more sophisticated, perhaps three-dimensional, virtual reality packages. Those wedding albums of still portraits will become a charming piece of history. But wedding albums and the photographers who created them paralleled my sojourn here on Earth, and they still have a central place in many lives. A friend of mine once shared with me snippets of the conversations that always seemed to go on in his house when the wedding photos were trotted out during family reunions. "Oh my God, look at Herbie with hair. Do you believe it? And those glasses on Aunt Selma. She never did have much of a fashion sense." Or as pages are flipped and the group shots begin to appear, the clucking begins. "He's dead. Oh, she's dead. Look at how thin she was," and so on. Photos help us remember. They're an important piece of every family's history. I tried to keep that in mind when officiating at weddings. The photos are of great significance. The photographer has a job to do, sure, to earn a decent living, but also in the larger scheme of things, to supply the bride and groom with a special treasure that they'll pass down through the generations. Sometimes tension would arise between the photographer, who wanted to produce the best shots, and me, committed to creating for the couple a warm, memorable wedding. I consider those ceremonies to be sacred events, not press conferences. So I would carefully instruct the photographers, while people are processing and recessing down and back up the aisle, you may do whatever you like. And when the couple reaches me, I'll pause so you can take a shot before we begin. But during the ceremony itself, no flash, no moving about the room. You're welcome to take available light shots, but only from the rear. And frankly, the professionals understood. They'd cooperate, and the couple would end up with lovely photographs. Sometimes we would even restage some poses under the wedding canopy immediately after the guests had left the room. I've officiated at hundreds of weddings. Some I remember very well, and many I've forgotten. Usually, of course, it's the bride and groom I recall. But there's one wedding that took place years ago, and not only can I not conjure up the faces or names of the people, but much as I try, I can't really seem to pinpoint if it took place during my days in Philadelphia or perhaps while I served the congregation in Buffalo. Yet I remember the photographer and what happened that night. I remember the photographer very well. I don't think I ever knew his name. He was just one more guy with a camera and a bag of equipment, appearing among the crowd of caterers and musicians and florists and others who operate on the periphery of a wedding. I arrived, as always, 30 minutes prior to launch time. The picture taking was running late. It's not unusual. I could work my way around it. I chatted with the groom's relatives while the couple and the bride's family were posing, then with the bride's relatives while the couple and the groom's family were similarly involved. The guests all were seated and restive, and the string quartet was already playing some of their music a second time. We were now officially late. I tried to move things along, signed the ketubah and the civil license, watched everyone line up, and made sure there was wine in the Kiddush cup. I hadn't really noticed the photographer. He was a new guy to me, new to me at least, and sort of prowled around those final preparations. I was about to weave my way through the tuxedos and gowns to tell him my policies when the harried wedding coordinator signaled the musicians and sternly directed me to walk to the chuppah, which I did without getting to the photographer. It's no problem. This had happened many times before. I had a simple, effective way of handling such situations. A brief announcement was all that was necessary, something I'd often done when I hadn't had time to prepare the photographer or when I'd encounter a bevy of guests with cameras in their hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said in a soft, composed voice, "in order to preserve the solemnity of these moments, I would ask that no flash pictures be taken until the conclusion of the ceremony." Everyone always complied. And that's how I began this particular wedding, with the announcement for the benefit of the guests, and especially for the benefit of the photographer, was at that moment standing in the rear of the aisle. Only something went wrong that night. Just as I completed the opening Hebrew blessings, a flash went off. I looked up to see the photographer in his tuxedo, camera chest high, tiptoeing down a side aisle and preparing to set up another shot. I was annoyed. And so in a firm, subdued, yet not particularly unpleasant tone, I interrupted with the reminder, "Please, no flash pictures until the end of the ceremony." Just as I began my address to the couple, from the right side of the room came another flash. I looked up, and there stood the photographer, off to the right of the second row, looking down at his equipment, resetting his camera for what I figured would be yet another intrusion. Now I was angry, and I could sense that the members of the wedding party were too. One more chance. If he does it one more time, that's it. I'm not going to allow this obnoxious guy to ignore what I'm saying and get away with this. He figures he'll sell more pictures, and the heck with me. One more time and he's out. A minute later, another flash. I clenched my teeth. Then I did something I'd never done before and never did again. I turned to the men's side of the wedding party and asked, would one of the ushers please escort the photographer from the room? And that's precisely what happened. For just a second, I could see the confused look on the photographer's face, but he went out obediently. Guests' heads nodded in support of my action, and I felt further vindicated by a grateful pat on the arm from the bride's father. We continued with the ceremony uninterrupted. And then it was over. The breaking of the glass, the kiss, the spirited applause, the wiping of tears, and the recessional. I followed the grandparents down the aisle, and when I reached the foyer, I encountered the usual scene: more hugging, more tears, veils and tides being straightened, and the wedding coordinator trying in vain at first, and finally with success, to line up the wedding party to receive the congratulations of their guests. I went through the line first. I had another commitment that evening and needed to depart fairly quickly. It was a lovely ceremony, they told me, just wonderful. And Rabbi, we're sorry about that photographer. Glad you took care of him. What an obnoxious jerk. That was it. Finished. It's time to leave. I gathered my robe and book and walked from the foyer into the entrance lobby. And there he was, the photographer. He was sitting on a bench against the wall, fishing in his equipment bag, preparing, I guess, to resume his picture taking. I hadn't counted on this. I was in a hurry, and besides, I hate confrontations. I really wanted to avoid him, but there was no way. He sat next to the only exit, and I had to pass right by him. He fiddled with his camera as I drew closer to him. Maybe he won't see me, I hoped. Maybe he'll keep on doing what he's doing until I pass through the door. But when I was about 20 feet away, he looked up, looked right at me for just a moment, and our eyes met. Then just as quickly, he lowered his eyes. It was too brief to read his expression. Anger, maybe. Embarrassment? I sort of hope so. Perhaps he was even sorry for what he had done. I walked ahead purposefully. I drew closer. His expression was more like that of a wounded puppy dog. That's what I decided. That's pretty much what I was thinking as I watched him from the corner of my eye. He continued to adjust the camera, and as he did, his head turned slightly, just slightly, in the direction of the exit door to which I had been heading. And then I saw it. I hadn't noticed it before. How could I? I had never been that close to him, and besides, so much else had been going on. I hadn't seen it. He turned his head, and for the first time I realized he was wearing a hearing aid. I felt an internal jolt go through me as I continued to walk toward the door. I could tell he wanted to avoid me as best he could, and now I wanted to avoid him as well. But he was trapped by where he sat, and I was trapped by the direction in which I had to go. I strode forward, eyes glued to the entranceway, while the photographer simply swiveled his head from one side to the other. He turned so that he would not be looking in my direction as I passed, and he looked as I passed to his left and through the front door. And as he turned, I could see in his other ear a second hearing aid. I left the building. I never saw the man again. But I remember that incident. I remember that man. And the question is, the thing that bothers me, the thing that sometimes keeps me awake at night, the thing that sometimes haunts me, it's this. How can I possibly say I'm sorry? It wasn't intentional. I wasn't being arrogant or purposely nasty. I was doing my job, trying to protect the bride and groom, trying to keep the wedding sacred and lovely. And I didn't know that the man was handicapped. But still, by my actions, I caused pain for another person. I felt terrible. What I saw in a sideward glance didn't register quickly enough for me to stop and speak with him. At that moment, I was still fuming and in a hurry, and I imagined neither he nor I were in any mood to chat. Decades later, I remember, and I always will. It's been many years, yet I can still see him in my mind, sitting there on the bench, rummaging through his equipment bag, his eyes downcast, a sad expression on his face, defeated. What I'd really like to do, is find him someday and look him straight in the eye, close up, close enough for him to hear me clearly or easily read my lips, and say to him just this: I'm sorry.